Dr. Faryal Luhar is a naturopathic doctor and graduate of Canadian College of Naturopathic Medicine in Canada. We welcome her to our wellness segment of the Mid-Morning Talk with myself, Najma Kota. It's such a pleasure to have you with us this morning, Dr. Faryal.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much for having me.
Our topic that we've chosen today is on unpacking stress and burnout and what the benefits of rest are. Now, let's first talk about the effects of stress and burnout, or what. Sorry, before you do that, let's define burnout and stress.
Yes,
Because I
that's a
think those
great
terms
starting point.
yeah.
Mm.
Sorry, I was going to say those terms are used quite loosely, but I don't think one understands the impact of what this can have on one's physical and mental well-being.
Yes, and this is the thing about stress, right? I mean, we know, especially over the last 3 years or so, that the stress levels have been probably at their highest globally. But stress is an inescapable part of life. It's not something that we can just avoid or shut down. We deal with stressors all the time. And so I just want to distinguish also that not all stress is bad, right, Najma? We have some
Hmm.
stressors that are positive. So, for
Hmm.
example, if you get a job promotion or if you're getting
Right.
married, these kinds of things can be positive stressors. Even me speaking to you right now, it's a positive stressor, right? And what
Sure.
happens in the body during a positive stress response is that you become more alert. So there's heightened alertness, the blood is flowing, the oxygen is getting where it needs to get to, and you're able to perform better, let's put it that way. But then we have
Right.
negative stressors as well. So the negative stressors could be things like loss of a loved one, losing the job, financial issues, having to take care of a sick, person or loved one. There are many, and sometimes these negative stressors sort of are compounded, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And
Mm.
the response to the stress is what's key. So if I were to just
Right.
take a simple example, like somebody sitting in traffic, you've got horrible traffic, you're sitting in traffic, most people would consider that a negative stress, right?
Yeah.
But now one's response is what's going to determine one's physical and mental outcome in terms of health. So one person might look at the situation and get very outraged and get very irritated and angry and even maybe have some road rage, shouting and
Sure.
screaming, right? Honking their horns. But another person might say, okay, I can't avoid this. This is how it is. I'm going to use this time to listen to my favorite podcast and stream into Salah Media, for example, right? And listen to
Sure.
something that's going to just like feed me and feed my brain and my soul and keep me calm. So it's a
Hmm.
very different response. And so that's going to determine the outcome. But the issue becomes when we're dealing with negative stresses for a long period of time. So, our bodies are amazing machines and they're built to deal with stresses. And then we go into what's called a fight or flight response. I'm sure you've heard of this and our audience is probably familiar. It's an arm of the nervous system that gets turned on to deal with whatever is in front of it. And then back in the day, the stressors that would turn on the sympathetic fight or flight would be things like running away from a saber-toothed tiger. Okay.
Right.
Today, our saber-toothed tiger is in the form of emails. It's in the form of, financial
Yeah.
issues. It's in the form of all these things I mentioned before. So this is
Right.
the issue: is that we're having multiple stressors that are going on for a long period of time, and if there's no resolution, this is where you start having physical and mental issues. Burnout, which I can talk about in a minute, is sort of the last stage of the stress
Okay.
exhaustion.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, in terms of the physiological changes in the body, and then one experiences the physical effects of it. Let's just say we start with fatigue, and then is that misinterpreted? How do we know when there is burnout, as it were?
Right. So that's a great question. And most people will suppress a lot of these types of symptoms, right? Feeling fatigued, feeling like they're not performing at their best mentally. There's issues with concentration or with focus. But then you start to have a lot of other issues. So you can start getting things like this exhaustion turns into insomnia, inability to sleep. And we know that sleep is so important because during sleep, that's where all the repair, the rejuvenation, the healing is happening to help us deal with what was going on during the day and then get us ready for the next day. So if we're not sleeping, we're obviously not going to be having those repair mechanisms in place. And then this
Mm.
starts to affect our immune system. So you get sick. One might complain of having a cold or a flu or a bronchitis or something like that. They have it and then they have it again 2 weeks later, and then they have it again another 2 weeks later. We also have susceptibility to certain kinds of viruses and bacteria, that because the immune system is suppressed during stress that is high. So the stress hormone that's released is cortisol.
Mm.
And if
Mm-hmm.
cortisol is not able to come down and it stays in the bloodstream for too long, it's going to create inflammation and
Mm.
susceptibility to infection. And we can even start to see autoimmune issues like Hashimoto's thyroiditis, or other types of autoimmune issues. But then most people will initially start complaining that they're gaining weight. They're having issues with their metabolic health, so their blood sugar levels are starting to go awry. They're starting to become almost pre-diabetic or diabetic. And then you can even have obviously high blood pressure. One of the bigger ones that tend to be what I see often is anxiety. Lots of
Uh-huh.
anxiety, depression. But burnout is, the situation wherein now one has become completely overwhelmed. They are
Mm-hmm.
just mentally, physically, emotionally completely overwhelmed. They're in distress, and the capacity to cope with the day to day demands of life or work are just not there anymore. So we literally tend to sort of almost fall apart. So it's important to recognize the early signs of the burnout in order to do something about it and to start working on stress management and that stress response I spoke about earlier.
Right. So how does one then contain the cortisol levels?
Great question. Yeah. So the thing with cortisol, Najma, is it's a really powerful, very important hormone, right? So,
Mm.
cortisol is what helps us deal with all the little stresses we face all day long. But what's important to appreciate is it has what's called a diurnal rhythm. So it's highest in the morning. And then
Uh-huh.
as we go through our day, it's almost like you have a full tank in the morning and then you use it up as you go through your day. By evening, and especially by nightfall, those levels should be at their lowest. That's a
Uh-huh.
healthy cortisol, what we call cortisol rhythm or cortisol curve. What's happening though is that many of us are not following this healthy cortisol curve. We're either waking up with an empty tank, so barely any cortisol to begin our day. So we already wake up agitated, moody, like when someone says that this person got up on the wrong side of the bed, that sort of thing, or
Mm.
exhausted. I'm sure many people can relate to the idea of you've slept, but maybe the sleep hasn't been deep enough or restorative enough, and you waking up exhausted. And then some people are waking up where their cortisol rhythm is flat. So it neither goes up nor does it go down. I think the worst situation is where the curve is the opposite way in terms of
Okay.
starting low and then it kind of builds up as the day goes on. And this is difficult because if you have too much cortisol surging through your system, you're not able to relax, you're not able to shut down, you're not able to fall asleep. So the good thing is we have tests. If people are concerned about what their cortisol curve looks like, there are tests we can do where we can measure the cortisol and we can see what does one's curve look like. And then if the adrenal glands, which are the little glands that sit on top of the kidneys, if they need support, then we can provide that support. And as a naturopathic doctor, I use only natural therapies and natural medicines, and I talk to my patients a lot about lifestyle practices as well to help
Yes.
with this type of situation.
Hmm. And being a naturopathic doctor, how well received is this in terms of the skepticism around it?
So when I first started 17 years ago, I've been in practice 17 years, and when I first went to naturopathic medical school in Canada, I was met with a lot of resistance, even from my loved ones who couldn't understand why I was going down this direction. But the interesting thing about naturopathic medicine is, it's been around for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. I mean, what were we using before antibiotics? What were we
Mm-hmm.
using before a lot of these chemical drugs came on the market?
Mm-hmm.
So at the end of the day, we have to appreciate that all of these traditional ancient healing, ways of treating, whether it's Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, Unani Tib, or what have you, have all been around for thousands and thousands of years, centuries. So naturopathic medicine is basically a very comprehensive system of medicine that looks at the person as a whole being, not in
Right.
parts. We treat the
Right.
mental, emotional, physical. It's a root cause medicine, and we're appealing to the body's ability to heal itself because we have
Mm-hmm.
that power. So the skepticism was definitely there, to answer your question. Having
Right.
said that, when I can look now at my journey, I've practiced in 4 different countries. I'm licensed
Mm-hmm.
in 3. And
Mm-hmm.
definitely there has been a paradigm shift where more and more and more people are seeking naturopathic or natural solutions, because even medical, doctors can see now that some of what they have to offer does have some limitations. That's not to say that conventional medicine doesn't have its place. It certainly does. It's a very important part of our healthcare. But I think for chronic diseases, naturopathic medicine really does provide some very effective solutions.
So, how does your diagnosis, differ from conventional medicine?
My diagnosis, that's a very interesting question, because I don't treat labels, I treat the person.
Uh-huh.
So of course, I mean, our training is the same as what medical doctors would go through. We just then, at the last couple of years of our schooling, we're focused on all these different naturopathic modalities, right? Clinical nutrition, botanical medicine, Chinese medicine, and acupuncture, homeopathy, and so on. So of course, we can clinically are able to diagnose using blood tests, using functional tests, and looking at the person and understanding their symptoms. So it doesn't differ a whole lot. It's just that with Chinese medicine, it's an Eastern philosophy. So we're using different ways of looking at the body to understand where the imbalances are.
Right.
It's difficult for me to pinpoint every little thing in a short,
Sure.
talk like this. But the beauty of naturopathic medicine is we're able to blend sort of the cutting edge medicines with tradition's old ways of treating people.
Oh. So, the body has an innate healing power, and the integration of naturopathic medicines and therapies. How can one integrate this? Because when you talk about therapies, what specific form of therapy are you uh, working with?
So, as I just mentioned, clinical nutrition, which is
Mm-hmm.
kind of the cornerstone of what I do. So every patient who comes in, I go very deep into what they're putting into their body, and we discuss a lot about diet, because I use food as medicine. So I will
Right.
not treat someone by giving them the 10 best natural medicines, but not
Mm-hmm.
looking at their diet, not touching their diet.
Sure. So it's
So,
lifestyle. Yeah.
all my patients
Mm-hmm.
already know that if they're going to come and see me, that we are going to look at the diet. There may be some drastic changes that need to happen, because in many cases, just simply making those dietary modifications resolves 50% or more of the issue. There are a lot of things we're eating today that are not feeding us, they're feeding the disease. So we
Right.
always have to ask the question, when you're eating something, you've got your plate of food in front of you, you should always ask the question, is this feeding me, or is it feeding my condition or a potential
Mm-hmm.
condition, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the first thing. And then I use herbs, plant-based medicines, homeopathics, Chinese medicines. I do a lot of acupuncture in my clinic and cupping. I do a
Mm-hmm.
lot of counseling, because my previous degree was in psychology, so it goes really well hand in hand. And then we use specific types of formulations that are called orthomolecular, or other types of they're different ways of extracting the active ingredients in plants to get the best effect inside a body. But typically, like I said, we're looking at the whole person. So if a person comes in to see me for a headache, I'm not treating the headache, I'm treating the reason they're having the headache.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In terms of the counseling aspect, I think that emotional well-being is so much a part of healthy physical and mental state.
versa also. I do feel that imbalances, when there's a
Right.
shift emotionally or mentally and it's not addressed adequately, that can result in a manifestation physically.
Right. So chronic pain can then create a mental issue or an emotional breakdown, as it were.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, obviously, if one is in pain all the time and if that pain is quite intense, it's absolutely going to affect their mental, emotional health and their resilience and their ability to cope, with day-to-day situations. And so it certainly should be addressed and to figure out, well, where is the pain coming from? Taking painkillers, which is something that we see a lot. People want to numb the pain. They don't want to feel the pain. They don't want to go through the pain. Do understand
Hmm.
that. I'm certainly not suggesting people should suffer through pain, but I think there is something to be said for trying to understand what is the body telling me? Why am I in pain? What is the gift of this message? And trying to address that using
Mm.
a therapy or a remedy that's going to address the root rather than just suppress or mask it.
Right. So are you then suggesting that if there's chronic pain from, say, osteoarthritis, what would then be the root cause? I know it's a very generalized question, but if we can
Yeah.
narrow it down a bit.
Okay. So I do want to point out, Najma, that there's no single answer and there's no
Yeah.
single factor that contributes to any chronic disease, right? You do
Sure.
have to look at one's genetics as well. So genetics do play a role. And when I say genetics play a role, again, my belief is that genetics can be passed on to create a weakness in a person's biochemistry, but it doesn't mean that that person will get the disease.
Sure.
What turns on the disease or what turns on the genes to manifest a disease is all based on lifestyle practices,
Right.
nutrition, stress management. I mean, it even goes down to thoughts and beliefs. So if your
Right.
audience hasn't read the book, The Biology of Belief by Bruce
Hmm.
Lipton, I would strongly recommend reading that book to understand how even the way we think and our beliefs and toxic
Mm.
thoughts and being around negative people, how that actually impacts our genes and their expression. So that's one thing. And then, of course, you have to look at lifestyle. You have to look at diet, because as I said before, if one has inherited certain weaknesses that could potentially lead to the development of osteoarthritis, and they're eating a diet that's full of takeaways, fast foods, inflammatory foods, processed meats, cool drinks, chocolates, lots of gluten, lots of dairy, there's a high probability they're turning on all of the mechanisms to help them get osteoarthritis. If, however, they have inherited this weakness and they're able to focus on an anti inflammatory diet, a diet that's full of beautiful, what we call antioxidants that protect the cells from damage, all the rainbow colored, brightly colored fruits, vegetables, legumes, they're cooking their food, it's organic, there's no herbs, no pesticides, there's no hormones, antibiotics. And on top of that, they are eating mindfully and they are hydrating well. They're doing some of these other lifestyle things like movement, good sleep. The chances that they're going to get osteoarthritis or that it's going to be quite bad are quite low. Does it make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, it does. And I suppose when you talk about optimal living and you empower people through that, um, uh, again, I know we have time constraints, but what would then be your key points there?
So I think I've probably,
Covered some of it, yeah?
emphasized quite a bit about the nutrition aspect, right? And I think this is huge because
Okay.
today what's very distressing is like every other day you hear about someone that you know or a loved one or someone that they know who's been diagnosed with cancer. I think you'd agree.
Hmm. Hmm.
There was a
Absolutely.
time where it
Mhm.
wasn't that prevalent, maybe 50, 60, 70 years ago. Now it's almost every other day, right? You're hearing someone has cancer. So every time I hear that, for me personally, as sad as it is and disturbing as it is to hear it, it's also frustrating because I wish I could talk to that person and say, well, what are you eating? And
Okay.
what have you been told you should eat and shouldn't eat? What are the treatments that you've decided to go ahead and get? And cancer is a whole other topic. But my point is the body only serves us as long as we serve it. So if
Uh-huh.
we're putting toxins, if we're constantly putting toxins in our body, and then we're taking a whole bunch of drugs, which are chemicals, which may work short term, but then they also build up this toxicity in the system, the poor liver and the poor kidneys, they can't keep up anymore because those are the organs that help us to detox. So when they can't keep up, those toxins remain in the system for a long time, and then they start to create other issues. So, it's very important to really pay attention to the diet, to even something as simple as the oil. What oil are you cooking with? I would ask the audience, because many people are using vegetable man-made oils, which are highly inflammatory,
Okay.
right? And the deep frying and frying foods, this just also creates a lot of issues with our cells. So cooking methods are important. If you can steam, if you can lightly saute, if you can roast, if you can, have things raw, and use anti-inflammatory oils like your grass-fed ghee, butter, or extra virgin olive oil or coconut oil. Those would be better options. But from that point on, I would then say for optimal living, our bodies are machines. They're not meant to be sedentary, they're meant to move. So we
Right.
don't have to spend 2 hours in the gym lifting weights, but we should spend a lot of time moving, whether
Uh,
it's with doing housework, whether it's walking, dancing, swimming, whatever tickles your fancy, but you got to move. That's a very important one because you're getting the blood flow going, which is helping to also improve oxygenation, getting the nutrients where they need to go. So these are all, they're simple things that we know. We just need to do them. And sleep is the other one. I think a lot of people
right.
are taking it for granted that, sleep is not that important. It's a
Mm-hmm.
waste of time, but it's not. There's so much going on during sleep. And
Mm-hmm.
if we're not sleeping well, first of all, we're getting fatter. Second of
Mm.
all, we're getting older, so you're aging faster. And thirdly, you're just, inviting the potential for disease.
Uh-huh. So, well, I suppose sleep, you've emphasized on that, would also equate to the importance of rest. But can we talk about rest in terms of, routine and lifestyle?
And I think that's such a great topic of that to emphasize for this topic, which is that there's nothing wrong with taking time to do absolutely nothing.
Nothing. Mm-hmm.
I think that
I not feel
unfortunately,
guilty. Yeah.
and not feel guilty. And I think this is the difficult part. A lot of
Mhm.
us feel that we need to be busy all the time. Some of us wear this like a badge of honor. When you meet your friend and you're asking them, how are you doing? And then we start sharing stories of how busy they are and how busy I am, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I think for some reason we've come to a point in our society where you've just got to be busy all the time. I mean, I don't know if you want to share your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. But then, as I said earlier, that then when you feel you need to rest, there's a guilt attached to it. So is it because you're wanting to match up to your friends, or not that there is a competition, but if you sit idle, it means there's something wrong with you. It means that you're lazy, or you're labeling yourself. um, so
Correct.
yeah. So I think that we can talk at length about how to uh, schedule time for rest, because if it's in your schedule, people who are stuck with very very confined to their routine, which is great in structure, which is important as well, but then fit in your rest time. Now I
Yes,
sound like the doctor.
absolutely. I do. No, but that's great. And we all, listen, we all have a doctor in us. We just have to
Mhm.
let that doctor guide us. We all have that wisdom to be able to do what's best for our bodies. It's just we ignore it. We tend to ignore it.
Mhm.
So for me, I would say the same thing that, if you need to schedule the rest, then please, just like you would schedule anything else, whether it's a fitness class or, a meeting or whatever, it's important to do that. But I think most important is getting into a routine where you're sleeping at the same time every day,
Mhm.
and ensuring that you're getting between 7 to 9 hours of sleep. That's what's been shown is ideal for adults. Of course, There's going to be some adults who don't need 7 to 9 hours. They can do really well on 6 hours, and that's fine. Every person is individual. Having said that, I think that it's important to make sure that you're sleeping in such a way that allows for the body to really go into that restorative sleep. So there's something called sleep
Right.
hygiene that a lot
Right.
of people are not practicing well, right? And so many of my patients, for example, are looking at their phones and their laptops and their devices and then falling asleep while they're looking at it or just before they fall asleep. Now, the problem with that is, besides the sort of electromagnetic disruption that comes from these devices that can impact our cells, you also have the blue light. And that blue
Mm-hmm.
light disrupts the body's ability to, or the brain's ability to produce melatonin. So,
Mm.
melatonin is a very powerful hormone, but it's the hormone that everybody knows helps us to sleep. If you are not able to make enough melatonin, you're not going to either fall asleep or stay asleep. There will be many disruptions through the night. So it all goes back to what we spoke about before. The cortisol levels are still high during the evening, nighttime. That's going to inhibit the brain's production of melatonin. It's an inverse relationship. So we need
Right.
the cortisol levels to come down so
Mm-hmm.
that the brain can say, okay, it's time to start shutting down. It's time for us to get rest and sleep. And
Mm-hmm.
let's start outputting this melatonin. But
Mm.
melatonin will not be produced in sufficient quantities if there's any light in the room. So the room should be so dark that if you put your hand out in front of your face, you shouldn't see it. It
Uh-huh.
should be a cool temperature room as well. If it's too warm, because the body naturally cools down when we're sleeping. And then just getting into some mindfulness practices before bed would be great, whether it's
Mm-hmm.
meditation or prayer or deep breathing or what have you. But sleep is a big part of rest, Najma. I just wanted to say that that's one thing people can truly, really
True.
just allow themselves to indulge in this beautiful feeling of having a nice, good, comfortable, happy sleep, whether it's taking a hot bath. If you have a bathtub and you put some Epsom salts in there with a little bit of lavender essential oil or whatever it is, but it's got to be a calming thing.
Right.
Anything that's too stimulating is going to be problematic. And then the other issue is blood sugar dysregulation. So if people are having issues with their blood sugars going up and down through the night, that typically is also what wakes them up. Okay.
Right.
Pain is another one. And then, rest during the day is a very interesting topic because I'm a huge fan of power naps during the day,
Uh-huh.
right? So go ahead.
Yeah, no, I would love to extend that discussion. I think we'll have to call you back on that. Just talking about looking after oneself and taking care of oneself is that simple, and yet we don't allow it, right? So, but being our very special guest this morning on our wellness segment, it's been an absolute pleasure. You've shared a lot of knowledge with us that we can take back, hopefully. Our naturopathic doctor and graduate of Canadian College of Naturopathic Medicine in Canada, Dr. Faryal Luhar also practices in Dubai. She's currently in Cape Town. Thank you very, very much, Dr. Faryal, for making time for us this morning. I'm so sorry we've run out of time at this
That's
point, but
okay.
we hope we'll catch up with you soon.
Absolutely. That would be wonderful. Thank you again to you and your team. It was really a wonderful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. When we come back in our travel segment, we speak to Dilshad Parker. And we're going to Drakensberg. Yes, we're still in South Africa, beautiful, picturesque South Africa.